Thank you so much. Thank you so much. Yesterday's speakers, it was great across the board. Also, super exciting today. Thank you so much, organizers, for putting together this really wonderful program. Thank you also to people helping out with coffees and food and everything, and cleaning afterwards and so forth. So, and everybody helping out here, taking photographs and so forth. Big thanks. Um, I'll introduce this in more detail soon, but as a word of caution or something. This is sort of like a two-part talk. First, there's a bit of talking, and then there's a film. I'll tell you more about what that is. So the talk will be a bit shorter, but the film, hopefully, or the video actually will be of interest. So it's really nice to be here as well. We with colleagues who are here, Tomasz, for instance, I was coming 5 years to Prague at FAMO for a project on operational images. Some of these topics relate to that, but I'm not talking about exactly that term. But the notion of invisuality features in that book. It's not really defined in the talk so clearly, but it does refer to that weird sort of form of datafication that sometimes features as images, but we're not necessarily looking at those as images in the traditional representational sense. I'll leave it at that as a bit of a teaser instead of really defining it, which is not great, but let's see where we end up as well. Now, this could be the alternative title for today as well, even more geeky, of how to think about cohabitation at the scale of 400 to 700 nanometers. I'll explain that a bit later. It relates to the ways in which light behaves. The talk itself will be all about light. It will have implications for heat, heating, coldness, as well as the forms of thermal control that are implied in many of the regimes, very concrete like greenhouses and other forms of architectures of environments, as well as the planetary condition, building on yesterday's really wonderful talks on planetary in multiple ways, planetary health and so forth. Now, I'll do something that I usually would never ever do. I don't do this kind of a thing, and then I do it. I start with a personal anecdote. It's a genre that I try to avoid, but it might be a good way into the topic. About 20 years ago, in 2004, I published my first monograph in Finnish. One of the reviews said something of the type, while Parikka is clearly enthusiastic about the new kinds of machines and new media theory, yada, 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 that populate imaginaries of digital technologies, he could do well to get his hands dirty in the agricultural context of, indeed, mechanical machines and soil and whatnot. Fair enough, the book was a bit of a product of its own time, enthusiastic about forms of subjectivity that certain forms of Deleuze-Guattarian theory promised, as well as at least a hint of post-human materialism, new materialism of Braidotti and others. But it was definitely less on mechanical, rural things. Already then I found this quite amusing, considering that I come from a family of farmers. I do not come from an upper middle class academic setting. Not that the reviewer could have known this, I hold no grudge. I spent most of my childhood in rural Finland, southeast Finland, quite close to the Russian border, next to a small farm. Although the farm animals, 3 cows, they disappeared when I was about 8 years old. Later, also, the wheat and rye disappeared. The whole farm closed down. It was mostly my grandfather who kept the farm somewhat alive and active until he died in the early 1990s. Now, what's interesting, perhaps in this little snippet, is that I realized only much later in discussions with my own father that something that I didn't originally remember about my grandfather, that he was an avid note-taker. Nothing literary as such, just observations about the weather. About the weather from the exact same spot. He wasn't a traveling man, he was a farmer. He stayed in that one spot, so to speak, over decades. Probably ever since he came back from the war, as in Second World War, having fought Soviet Union on the Eastern Front of Finland for a good part of 6 years. There were no heroic stories of war, not usually even a mention of it. Something I afterwards think it was mostly due to it being obviously traumatic. You do not want to talk about it anymore. His observations were mostly about weather. Noted down in one of the almanacs that was distributed back then by the Agricultural Society. I did not find them. I tried recently over the past 6 months. Significant, though, is to consider these two as agricultural techniques. Ones that do not seem to speak to datafication in the register that we now think of it as digital data, big data, computerization, but or the managerial sense, but part of this longer legacy of cultural techniques of numbers about the environment, about weather, about the impact of weather patterns upon the soil and yields, crops, on a very small farm in southeast Finland. Numbering of weather has a long history, enumeration. Some of it is very famous, including people who held owners of enslaved people like Jefferson in the US. But it does persist across different kinds of examples across Europe and beyond. Over the past years, I've been working with this project that is soon ending on design and aesthetic for environmental data. The headline of the project that I work with two people, an urbanist and critical theorist and an architect, was to think about spatial formations of environmental data. In which kinds of spatial typologies does environmental data hit the ground? It means concretely architectures or spatial divisions and technical lands like plots. And obviously you can think of the long history of the violence of the plantation system as a form of spatial control that I would read into a datafication of sorts as such. Obviously, this then leads into my interest in agriculture as well, but more on that in a second. This was made easy by other people who've been working on similar topics. Jennifer Gabriels and many others who have done work around cultural, social, political questions of datafication. Now, for me, I was interested. In a way, these two things positively keep on haunting me, and they lead into my kind of a more defined topic. I forgot to put the timer on, but I'll keep an eye on the watch. One is namely really about space and architectures of environmental data. Henri Lefebvre's note could be just one. In a way, it kind of leads into thinking about, okay, if data is a new kind of a form of production and organizational logic that we also touch upon in some of our talks in this conference, what is the form of space that is invented for data? We'll think of data centers, extensive research around infrastructures of data, but I'm also interested in how it might feed into other forms of landscaping and architecturing, indeed, and soon a bit more. I'm interested in a slightly aside part of the project in history of architectures of data in those terms that some architectural historians have also been dealing with. And then the question of agriculture as data, or as I prefer it, abstract agriculture, my new research topic. In other words, what is abstraction in relation to cultural techniques that make the thing that we don't often define possible? In other words, the idea that, okay, data is abstract, well, is it really? I would go as far as claim that data is way too concrete, and that's the problem, but that's a sidetrack. And instead looking at the long history of the ways in which particular forms of holding together numbers, but also infrastructures about enumeration take place. Indeed, enumeration itself, but also grids and other spatial forms of divisions, modeling and simulation, and standardization, the forms of trial and experimentation that themselves have a history of science. I was trained as a historian, so I like to think in terms of different time layers as such. I'll try to balance today a bit between the two, although slightly more on couple of really specific topics. And as I promised or threatened, I will try to do also a film at the end, which is not on agriculture, but it really puts together two poles of my interest in light, of what is light as part of environmental cohabitation. So, a couple of steps back briefly. The focus on new layers of control and precision in agriculture has been a theme since the 1990s. We had a bit of agriculture yesterday already. This characterizes the combination of business-driven discourses and managerial discourses around sustainability in relation to, for instance, like yesterday, reduction of fertilizer use and such technologies that, and the ways in which it intersects with questions of food, food security and crops and whatnot. Especially the period since 2010 has seen an immense growth in writing, but also testing of precision agriculture, which is usually the go-to when you mention the words data about agriculture, right? The same period has seen more and more research that also talks about, yesterday we heard planetary boundaries, about destabilizing Earth systems at the planetary scale, where agriculture in the kind of industrial sense is one of the key problems in that kind of way. The ways in which biogeochemical flows have contaminated lands across the planet in significant ways. Now, food is one of those things we cannot live, and hence it's a really interesting existential choice of really about design in those terms. Not the technocratic design, but also the design that thinks through multiple histories, including colonial histories, as ways of thinking about possible futures and how building past, and I'm not talking about human past, but literally a past that is a sedimentation of fertilizer waste upon soil, determines the ways in which we think about futures. There's multiple other variables at play nowadays as well. The ways in which we cannot talk about food systems without thinking about both the overproduction of food, it's not that we have a scarcity of food, and the ways in which weaponization of starvation is in operation in various parts of the world, not least in Gaza. Aptly, Ghassan Abu Sittah has mentioned this, coined this situation as biosphere of genocide, as an entry point to some themes mentioned yesterday as well. In broader terms, it concerns of metabolic systems that characterizes living bodies like humans, what goes in, what comes out, but also the metabolism of new kinds of landscapes, which themselves, especially in the image form here as well, are premised on datafication like remote sensing. I'm thinking about the exact images as such, not just what they depict. Metabolism of production of landscapes, including the larger scale terraforming that happens at the back of historical legacy of industrial agriculture like feedlots in the US, that is blood, as well as the forms of immense agricultural architectures that are growing across the world, according to the most recent research, especially in so-called Global South, as well as China, which complements really interestingly what happened in Europe across 60s and 70s in terms of increasing greenhouses as such. Greenhouses haven't disappeared from Europe. Look at Poland, look at southern Spain, so forth. Some of these landscapes are blood, some of these landscapes are glass, some of these landscapes are plastic. It is a particular kind of a mess. Control seems totally uncontrollable, but it's an aspiration that speaks in relation to particular techniques that make growth happen or diminish growth, like with techniques of using herbicides as part of warfare in Gaza. All of this is very broad, I admit, but we'll try to focus on a particular really concrete thing. Let's see where I'm with this. To consider agriculture, at least in the more recent period of past couple of 100 years, a specific case of median architecture is not far-fetched. The modern architecture of the greenhouse or hothouses came to play a key role in the material history of glass-encased buildings, which, as is well known, really well known, is a particular spectacle for the mid-19th century Victorian England, among, of course, other places, but it was really that site that was really interesting. Much of it was about the new material of glass, standardized glass, that structured human and non-human space together with iron beams that worked like a structuring rib cage for plants. This history is so well known, there's no point in repeating it, but there are elements that come to feature in my story as well. Let me park the setting though here. Agricultural light, if we focus on not just data as numbers, but as light, and I'll explain why, is not just dependent on the solar rays that enable complex life on planet, including the processes of photosynthesis as an atmosphere-generating mechanism, as a key principle around which much of chemical reactions of life function. A set of technologies for optimization, or I would call it programming light, have taken hold of imaginaries as well as real infrastructuring of light and cohabitation for modern humans in relation to human politics and human eating. There's one or two things, especially here, of interest. On the one hand, technologies that tap into very specific wavelengths useful for plants, or at least so the claim goes. In some versions, it's the 400 to 700 nanometer range, mostly red and blue light, not exclusively as such. But it would be mostly a simplification, like much more holistic research says that it's actually much broader wavelength that plants need. But a lot of it is still parked in this idea of optimization of what light makes us grow, or at least plants. Secondly, with visible light being one aspect, invisible or invisual radiation is another. The other aspect of the ways in which datafication of the planet has happened is historically parked in relation to Earth observation technologies. We had a bit of yesterday about these things. Earth observation technologies that gradually, especially in the 1970s when the more official Earth satellites, Earth environmental satellites, Landsats emerge, build a particular kind of sensing system that itself is not premised anymore on visible light so much as increasingly on multispectral and hyperspectral sensing. In other words, on other spectra than visible light. This is why my interest as a humanities scholar as well. My premise in operational images is that when most of humanities and art has been across its history, however you want to count it, 500 years, 1,000 years, perhaps 1,500 years, premised mostly on visible light. That is what we do. We look at things that are visible. I think the big task for humanities is to start building, and have been doing, a particular kind of an approach and understanding of why invisible light is where a lot of politics happens. Hence, the stakes are massive, both in relation to planetary, but also on a very particular levels of techniques of trying to understand, for instance, plants as particular radiation patterns, right? Let's focus on the first one here. I need to hurry up so that I can actually show the film. I'll do this really quickly, even if it's not ideal. The deciphering of light in separate bands is a story that a lot of it focuses on 19th century. It has to do with particular histories of science, of physics, or light as physics, that has a longer history, but also the ways in which particle understanding of different bands of light comes to play a role, both in what could be said to be an early form of remote sensing imagery, imaginary. Some of that is in my operational images book, but also in these very concrete places, which not surprisingly deal with both photography as a particular concrete media technology, but also how it's spilled over into new kinds of optimized architectures, but not for humans, but for plants. In other words, all the techno discourse that we think is now, that I'll mention briefly, is now prevalent in relation to high-tech greenhouses, is more or less born around 19th century, and with figures such as Robert Hunt. Mostly known for his work on experimental photography, he was also into mineralogy, but he was also commissioned to do this particular project for the very lovely, but also very colonial Kew Gardens in London. Short version. People invested in the architectural and the glass structures of Kew Gardens were quite worried about the ways in which transparent glass will gather too much heat. It will literally turn into an oven for the plants gathered from colonial expeditions across the world. Hence, they commissioned Hunt to produce, based on his research, and produce new research on what would be the right kind of a tinting, what kind of a glass color would be the right one to filter heat, but let in other kinds of radiation, right? Simple. There's nothing kind of a, now we kind of know this stuff really well. It wasn't then also like super new, but there was like an emerging amount of research across physics and photography around this as well. His work became central in the reglazing of Kew Gardens, or at least that was the plan. And in the ways in which he was interested in this, to address the possible issue of overheating, he was tasked to investigate indeed what colors are best for this as well. In his experimental setups that I won't go into that much as such, he set up various kinds of seeds and sort of a germinating plants in relation to a long-term exposure for various flights, blue, red, green, and such, building particular kinds of forms of understanding of which wavelengths relate, of course, mostly to light, which to heat, but also which relate to what he proposed as actinism, a particular kind of an energy that he said pertains both to photography and plant life. It's basically, in the simple term, about the measure of chemical reaction upon a particular surface. But it's sort of a hinted that there would be this particular wavelength which would really spark up growth in plants, right? Now, it's interesting. 19th century scientific sources are wonderful. They have this wonderful notion of discourse, I mean, wonderful flavor of discourse about secret principles and the ways in which there must be something lurking at the background. Hunt is one of those as well. There would be a longer, beautiful story about the ways in which this, of course, as most things, it does fail. It doesn't work like that. I think they ended up with something very blunt at Kew Gardens as such. But the point is really interesting because it already hints at the idea that there are certain light conditions that do not just filter, but they program the particular environment in a certain kind of way. This is not programming in the digital sense. It's an architectural and glass-based programming of modern human life. You can see this as part of all kinds of things that we usually dislike quite a lot, controlled, technocratic reasoning, but it's also curious as a trial, as an experiment in relation to such worlds. Kew Gardens, of course, is not really agriculture, but the implications for large-scale agricultural growth gradually themselves, excuse the pun, grow across 20th century much more. There would be a lot to be said about all kinds of things. He devised a thing called actinograph that was to measure that secret principle. Actinograph features in history of meteorology in a couple of other ways later on, but I won't go into that. I'm running out of time and I want to go into the other lights soon as well to make sure we get to see the film. This brief episode is somewhat following themes that we started building in the book Living Surfaces with my collaborator Abelardo Gil-Fournier, a Madrid-based artist. We wanted to think about the spatial notion of surfaces, whether it's ground surfaces, soil, glass, or interface surfaces, as particular forms of mediation across architectures, but also literally screens as such. Thinking of the ways how they've been sometimes collapsed, sometimes co-determining across a history of roughly 200 years of environmental management. That's enough to park it there. The point here is about programmability as such. Again, there would be a longer, slightly more beautiful version that I wrote down, but I'm just giving you the headlines here. I'm interested in this, that everything that I mentioned could be seen as just a special case of a particular kind of thing that we think pertains to digital culture, in other words, filters. It's an invention of filtering in those kinds of visual cultures that are not just about visible light, but about filtering all other forms of radiation at the same time, including heat, right? It is a form of thermal control, a big topic across humanities as well as media studies. What I want to say is exactly that it's not just a reduction of light, it is also increase in particular kinds of light environments that comes to play a role. This comes really visible, excuse the pun, it wasn't intended, in also very several contemporary scientific phytodrone experiments, but also phytodrones are controlled experiment rooms for scientific testing, like with plants, with specialist lights where you can simulate, for instance, the normal sort of a sunlight patterns of any kind of a room. There's one in Denmark that is still operational in Riese. These kinds of situations, which also feature in many greenhouses, including across Europe as such. Controversial whether they actually are so determined on specific wavelengths. They still tell a story about this particular desire to find the secret principle of a particular wavelength that would speak to plants as such. There would be a lot to be said about artistic work that deals with these kinds of things. I don't have time to go into that. Just a hat tip to many who have been doing it over the past years, and more is coming as such in the coming years. But this is really mostly like a snippet to park my kind of enthusiasm that I'm sharing with you in terms of the most basic that has to do with humanities, in other words, light. I wasn't trained as an art historian, but I've become, the only time I worked with photography was with FAMU as such. But these kind of questions of leaking of photographic notions into architecture, but also landscapes has been haunting me. So, in other part of my life, I continue to agriculture research, but it also deals and intersects so as to frame the question of light. I'm going to show the film if we have 18 minutes, yeah? Yeah, we have. Yeah, let's do it. Let's be bad and let's go over time. No, we won't go much over time. Something different. So whereas that is really about the connections that we need to think of data in relation to much more than enumeration and abstraction, it's also concretization of particular optimization, whether you love it or not, in terms of architectures. More on that in a Q&A, I hope. Here's another thing that I wanted to share on the side. This is not just different light, but also about a different version of cohabitation with light and the ways in which it builds a certain kind of a thermal control, or imaginary of thermal control, around questions of coldness, melting, and snow. As part of our work with Abelardo on light and surfaces, we, together with the sound artist Maria Andueza Olmedo, produced a new video essay that investigates planetary light and the albedo effect. It was just last week installed at the Lisbon Architecture Triennial, where it contributes to the section on lighter as part of the curatorial theme, How Heavy is the City? We will watch it now as part of my discussion about light as a transformative force, but really a brief words. I'm not going to do a whole explanation of what's going on here, but a couple of notes. Lumi, which is Finnish for snow, is not on agriculture, but on the disappearance of high reflectance snow surfaces. It started off as a story about the albedo effect, the ways in which a particular measure for reflectance index from light surfaces to the absorption across dark surfaces, which is one of the key things that climate scientists would be looking at across Arctic regions as well. Molecular levels of dark surfaces that absorb light and then basically recursively increase heating as such. We were fascinated about the idea of thinking through histories of light, not in the humanities sense necessarily, but as these patterns of growing and diminishing darkness and light. Darkness plays a role in the ways in which this has a particular hint towards legacies of video art. I'll pour you a coffee if you guess what afterwards. As well as being pitched in a particular genre of climate fiction or science fiction, as it features a sort of a synthetic intelligence, who or which, the gender not necessarily known, collective, yes, who designed it, we do not know, is tasked with, has the task of going through old photographic archives to basically reconstruct surfaces of optimized light as part of reconstruction of coldness. Now, this might seem a bit detached, and there's a whole detached zone feeling about it as well. But I want to put you also thinking about coldness in those terms that, for instance, Susan Shipley, a dear friend, but also a wonderful colleague and a video artist, has done in some of her works on coldness as a right, building on indigenous activists' work in relation to recognizing that what is the right of right to coldness in terms of Arctic region inhabitants, but also in relation to these more modern human questions of, does ice have a right not to be broken? These are Susan's work from some of her video work. And even if we don't have this explicit reference, I want to think of you of that as part of the sort of framework of what is coldness as a particular quality or temperature that is mediated here. Right. Why I wanted to park it here as well is because it participates in the architectural discourse around questions of thermal control, but light and lighter, playing with the notion of heaviness, pollution, but also light. And that's really is the thing that haunts me as well, is that what is the particular form of chemical force, as well as control, and even sort of a programmability of light in those terms as such. The register of this is, of course, more artistic than academic, but we wanted to put it, I wanted to bring it to this context because it has a relation to the themes we our topics, but also shows, like we had yesterday, different methodologies of dealing with some of these as well. And I know this speaks to Joanna's interest a lot as well, of dealing with creative practice is part of our work. So yeah, let's do this. But thank you for this talking part.